Material culture was instrumental in the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. Rather than relying on purely spiritual or visionary experiences, physical objects were imparted to Joseph Smith for use in its production, as we've heard earlier today, the plates, the breastplate, the interpreters. But he was also shown, along with the witnesses, artifacts that also validated its foundational narratives. The Liahona, for example, and the Sword of Laban. Although Joseph interacted with these objects through supernatural means, he found significance in other ancient objects that were found in more mundane ways. Long after the production of the Book of Mormon, Joseph continued to show interest in artifacts that he believed supported the historicity of the Book of Mormon. He left precious few first-person accounts of his encounters with such objects, so we are often limited to second- or third-hand accounts found in newspaper articles, journals, etc., of those who claim to have been present with the prophet during such discoveries or interactions. This paper will review then the accounts in which Joseph or his close associates became aware of or interacted with and subsequently commented on Native American artifacts, regardless of whether they were genuine or not. Our aim is to understand the ways in which he and others used such objects to bolster the truth claims of the various scriptures that Joseph Smith had helped to bring forth. Now, late sources indicate that the Book of Mormon was coming forth, one of the primary concerns of Joseph and the men who were to sign their names as witnesses to the plates was that the claims of advanced civilizations described in the book itself would prove too far-fetched for anyone to believe. And by their own admission, it was simply too inconsistent with what was commonly believed about Native Americans at the time. Though poorly sourced, it is alleged that when Joseph Smith received the plates, he got down on his knees before the Lord and said, "O God, what will the world say?" And the voice of God came to him and said, "Fear not, I will cause the earth to testify of the truth of these things." David Whitmer similarly recalls, when we, meaning the witnesses, were first told to publish our statement, we felt sure the people would not believe it. For the book told of a people who were refined and dwelt in large cities. But the Lord told us that he would make it known to the people, and people should discover the ruins of lost cities and abundant evidence of the truth of what was written in the book. Perhaps notably, the Lord does not encourage Joseph or his followers to actively search for such ruins or evidence. Even though they were surrounded by burial mounds or tumuli, as they were sometimes called, virtually everywhere they settled, there was never an active program to excavate them. In this regard, the saints were very comfortably situated in the cultural context of their day. The discipline of North American archaeology was still in its infancy, an era that we now refer to as the speculative period, which began in 1492 with Columbus and lasted until 1840. According to North American archaeologist Larry Zimmerman, epistemologically, during the speculative period, people were mostly pre-scientific. What they knew was based on theological models of explanation. Essentially, if something wasn't in the Bible, it had no real explanation. The expectation then was that the Bible would explain the sometimes strange things that were being unearthed by antiquarians. And conversely, the artifacts and remains would validate the biblical narrative. In this regard, again, Joseph and his followers were very much products of their time. The primary difference, of course, was that for them, the Book of Mormon supplanted the Bible in its ability to explain Native American artifacts. In the inaugural issue of the Evening and Morning Star in June of 1832, for example, it contains a brief article that proclaims, independent of Bible proof on the subject before us, we have the remains of towns, cities, forts, etc., which silently declare to the beholder, we were built by a civilized people. At the end of Joseph's life, American archaeology was just beginning to transition into the classificatory descriptive period, which marked the first attempts to systematically document indigenous artifacts and architecture, which lasted from 1840 until 1914. It's not until 1866, for example, that the Peabody Museum of Ethnology and Archaeology is established at Harvard, which is the first museum in the country devoted entirely to anthropology. Among non-Latter-day Saints, skeletal remains of megafauna were often misconstrued as human remains and touted as evidence of the biblical accounts of giants. Josiah Priest, for example, in his 1833 American Antiquities wrote that, quote, there are those who imagine that the first inhabitants of the globe, or the antediluvians, were much larger than our race at the present time. As evidence, he describes the discovery of, quote, several skulls, legs, and thigh bones in Indiana, which plainly show their possessors were persons of gigantic stature. Many of these were the bones of dinosaurs or mammoths even. So early Latter-day Saints, however, Such remains were those of the more recent Jaredites, who they believed to be a large race of people. In the August 1832 issue of the Evening and Morning Star, an article entitled The Book of Ether declares, as to the Jaredites, no more is known than is contained in the Book of Ether. Perhaps the Dighton Writing Rock, which is a big boulder in Massachusetts with petroglyphs on it. I said perhaps the Dighton Writing Rock in Massachusetts may hold an unknown tale in relation to these pioneers in the land of liberty, which can yet be revealed. God is great, and when we look abroad in the earth and take a glimpse through the long avenue of departed years, we can not only discover the traces in artificial curiosities and common works and small hills, mountain caves, and extensive prairies, where the Jaredites filled the measure of their time, but as they were a large race of men, whenever we hear that uncommon large bones have been dug up from the earth, we may conclude that was the skeleton of a Jaredite. The conclusion that uncommon large bones must have belonged to the Jaredites rather than antediluvian biblical giants was simply the Mormon twist on the common folk belief prevalent in the United States at the time. The February 1833 edition of the Evening and Morning Star contains an article entitled Discovery of Ruins in Central America. Again, this is 1833. It was written in response to an 1831 letter penned by an army officer and an explorer named Juan Galindo, which was first published in the London Literary Gazette. Galindo detailed some of the impressive ruins he had encountered in the Petén region of Guatemala. So the Evening and Morning Star, responding to this, says, "We are glad to see the proof begin to come of the original or ancient inhabitants of this continent. It is good testimony in favor of the Book of Mormon, and the Book of Mormon is good testimony that such things as cities and civilizations prior to the 14th century existed in America." Helaman in the Book of Mormon gives the following very interesting account of the people who lived upon this continent before the birth of the Savior, and then he quotes from Helaman. In addition to the above, Nephi relates what took place at the crucifixion of the Lord, and should ruins of many cities be discovered, it would be no more than confirmation of what was once on this land of the Lord. Now, it bears noting that they're referring to ruins in Guatemala. Whenever Joseph or later brethren, Brigham Young, Orson Hyde, Orson Pratt, Wilford Woodruff, when they say this land, this continent, it actually refers to the whole of America. It's not limited to North America. And in this, they're referring to this continent as Guatemala. Another article appeared in the Evening and Morning Star just a few months later, entitled Good Proof, in June of 1833. The article described the discovery of foundations of an ancient stone house in Rowan County, North Carolina, as well as an artificial peach and pear, which had been intricately carved in stone and found some 27 feet below the surface in Cincinnati, Ohio. And so the article states, "No people that lived on this continent since the flood understood many of the arts and sciences better than the Jaredites and Nephites, whose brief history is sketched in the Book of Mormon. The facts following from The Star in the West," which is a book containing some of these antiquities, "is not only proof of their skill, but it is good proof to those that want evidence that the Book of Mormon is true," and "is true" is in capital letters. Though the author of this piece is uncertain, it's probably W.W. Phelps. It demonstrates the general eagerness of the saints during Joseph's lifetime to attempt to prove the Book of Mormon true. Notably, issues of specific geography locations are apparently of no concern to anyone at this point. There seems to be no conflict in using Mesoamerican evidence in February and North American evidence in June of the very same year. About a year after the Good Proof article appeared, members of the Zion's Camp March, led by Joseph Smith, crossed the Illinois River at Phillips Ferry on June 2nd of 1834. Less than 1 mile south of where they crossed was a very large mound. And the next day, on June 3rd, several members of the camp went to explore the area and do a little digging. Unfortunately, due to discrepancies in all 6 of the primary accounts of that day, none of which come from Joseph Smith, it's impossible to ascertain exactly what Joseph actually said as the events unfolded. In essence, during the course of their excavation, they found some skeletal remains, 1 to 2 feet beneath the surface, with an arrowhead embedded in or near the ribs, and Joseph proclaimed that the remains belonged to a righteous Lamanite warrior, and perhaps a prophet, named Zelf, who was killed in battle while serving under the great king, or sometimes called a warrior, or sometimes called a prophet, Onondagas. They also found 3 altars, having been erected one above the other, according to the ancient order, and the remains of bones were strewn over the surface of the ground. In a letter to his wife Emma, dated the next day, June 4th, Joseph recounts the experience only very generally. He says, "The whole of our journey, in the midst of so large a company of social, honest, and sincere men, wandering over the plains of the Nephites, recounting occasionally the history of the Book of Mormon, roving over the mounds of that once beloved people of the Lord, picking up their skulls and their bones as a proof of its divine authenticity, and gazing upon a country, the fertility, the splendor, and the goodness so indescribable, all serves to pass away the time unnoticed. Now, although he makes no mention of Zelf, he explicitly states that the physical remains and location are proof of the Book of Mormon's divine authenticity. Now, modern archaeological excavations of the Zelf mound, which is technically designated as the Naples Russell's Mound number 8, describe it as a ceremonial mortuary center for regional Hopewellian populations during the early portions of the Middle Woodland period, which date to about 50 BC to 100 AD, uncalibrated. The remains found by Zion's Camp March would therefore date squarely to Book of Mormon times, but as neither Zelf nor Onondagas are named in the Book of Mormon, and the primary sources differ as to the nature of the battle in which Zelf was killed. Some say it was a final battle, some say it was Nephite versus Lamanite, or Lamanite versus Lamanite, we don't know. We can do little more than speculate about the precise relationship of Zelf to the Book of Mormon narrative. Now, the stone arrowhead that was found among the ribs was supposedly taken as a keepsake, but there's conflicting accounts as to who took it. Some say it was Elder Riggs, some say Brigham Young. Wilford Woodruff later states that it's in the possession of President Joseph F. Smith in Salt Lake City. There is a projectile point located in the church archives that is believed by some to be the very point that was found in the ribs of the skeleton. However, the former archivist for the church, Donald T. Schmidt, stated that there are no indications that this is the same arrowhead spoken of by Wilford Woodruff. And it should be noted that the arrowhead in the church archives is likely either a modern reproduction or a Western Great Basin Aboriginal point from the Salt Lake Basin. Morphologically, it seems to be an Elko corner-notched variety. Now, the point was apparently either miscatalogued or acquired at some point, perhaps to fill in a void in the Joseph Smith collection in Salt Lake. A couple years later, in May and June of 1838, Joseph led a number of expeditions up to Daviess County, Missouri, to survey potential settlement locations for the Saints. They encountered several Native American ruins during these expeditions. On May 19th of 1838, George Robinson, who was serving as the general church recorder and clerk of the First Presidency at the time, recorded in the scriptary book that, quote, "The next morning we struck our tents and marched across Grand River at the mouth of Honey Creek at a place called Nelson's Ferry. We next kept up the river, mostly in timber, for 10 miles until we came to Colonel Lyman White's, who lives at the foot of Tower Hill, named by President Smith in consequence of the remains of an old Nephitish altar or tower where we camped for the Sabbath. Heber C. Kimball also recollects this event, but he describes it a little bit differently. Or perhaps it's a different moment. He says, the prophet Joseph called upon Brigham Young, myself and others, saying, Brethren, come, go along with me and I will show you something. He led us a short distance to a place where the ruins of 3 altars built of stone, one above the other, one standing a little back of the other, like unto the pulpits of the Kirtland Temple, representing the order of 3 grades of priesthood. There, said Joseph, is the place where Adam offered up sacrifice as he was cast out of the garden. The altar stood at the highest point of the bluff. I went and examined the place several times while I remained there," close quote. Now, there is some confusion that exists concerning the different altars that were found in May and June of 1838. It's unclear whether the Nephitish altar and the Adamic altar are one and the same, or if they were in fact 2 different altars. Elder Alvin R. Dyer suggests that there were 2 altars. One of these, an altar of prayer, he locates not far from Lyman White's house on Tower Hill. The other, an altar of sacrifice, that's said to have been situated a mile or so away on the top of Spring Hill, which, if Heber C. Kimball's account is correct, may have actually been a single ritual locus comprised of a triple altar complex. Now, 3 days later, on March 22nd, they came across another set of ruins. The scriptary book records, quote, President Smith and myself followed on in their course, but could not find them, consequently, returned to camp in Robinson's Grove. We next scouted west in order to obtain some game to supply our necessities, but found or killed none. We found some ancient antiquities about 1 mile west of the camp, which consisted of some stone mounds, apparently low set in square piles, though somewhat decayed and obliterated by the almost continual rains. Undoubtedly, these were made to seclude some valuable treasures deposited by the aborigines of this land. Now, the use of the word undoubtedly in this account may seem to indicate that this was to be understood as speculation rather than prophetic proclamation. Although Robinson mentions the mounds were intended to seclude some valuable treasures, there's no indication that they dedicated any time to digging for them. This account is somewhat anomalous in that the aborigines of this land are not explicitly linked to scriptural peoples in any way, although the reference to secluded treasures may have been an allusion to Book of Mormon passages that refer to the fate of treasures that are hidden up or by those that hide them, for example, in Helaman. but that the ruins are in the same vicinity as those explicitly linked to either Nephitish or Adamic altars may suggest that the connection to Scripture is implicit. On April 3rd of 1841, Charles Anthon, the one visited by Martin Harris, penned a letter to Reverend Dr. Coit in New York, giving his version of the events concerning Martin Harris and the characters copied from the plates. Anthon admits that he could not recall the name of his visitor and refers to him somewhat derisively as a countryman. He goes so far as to suggest that perhaps it was Joseph Smith himself in disguise. In the September 15th, 1841 edition of the Times and Seasons, they published a letter sent by Charles W. Wandell from New York, he having seen this letter of Charles Anthon. And he effectively turned Anthon's criticism onto its head and attempted to demonstrate that Anthon's own words served to prove the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. He notes that Anthon's description of the characters presented to him closely matched the description of writings found in Josiah Priest's American Antiquities, which wasn't published until after the Book of Mormon had come forth. Now, Priest's Antiquities gets a lot more attention in the Times and Seasons. In the May 2nd, 1842 issue, there's an article entitled A Catacomb of Mummies Found in Kentucky, which is in direct response to a section by that same name found in Priest's book. Now, Priest is summarizing an account by a Mr. Thomas Ashe. He's only called Mr. Ashe by Josiah Priest and later by the editor of the Times and Seasons, who I think was Joseph Smith at the time. Mr. Ashe had published a letter in 1808, a book in 1808, wherein he recounted finding a catacomb near Lexington, Kentucky. Mr. Ashe estimated that the catacomb would have contained upwards of 2,000 mummies, though the majority of them had been intentionally trampled into dust and burned by the, quote, profane and violating hands, unquote, of white men bent on taking revenge on the Indians. Josiah Priest quotes Mr. Ashe's lamentation, how these bodies were embalmed, how long preserved, by what nations, and from what people descended. No opinion can be formed, nor any calculation made, but what must result from speculative fancy and wild conjecture. For my part, I am lost in the deepest ignorance. My reading affords me no knowledge, my travels no light. I have neither read nor known of any of the North American Indians who formed catacombs for their dead, or who were acquainted with the art of preservation by embalming. Josiah Priest then, as he cites Ashe, he claims that the Egyptians had 4 methods of embalming and suggests, I cannot think it presumptuous to conceive that the American mummies were preserved after that very manner, or at least with a mode of equal virtue and effect. And then in the Times and Seasons, we read this response, which is nearly gloating, for lack of a better word. They say, had Mr. Ashe in his researches consulted the Book of Mormon, his problem would have been solved, and he would have found no difficulty in accounting for the mummies being found in the above-mentioned case. This art was no doubt transmitted from Jerusalem to this continent by the before-mentioned emigrants, which accounts for the finding of the mummies, and at the same time is another strong evidence for the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. And it's signed by the editor. The following month, the Times and Seasons cites yet again from Priest, but also cites from Ethan Smith's view of the Hebrews concerning some pieces of old parchment that had been discovered that appeared to have writing on them. The parchment were said to have been sent by their discoverer, a Mr. Joseph Merrick, Esquire, a highly respectable character, to Cambridge, where they were examined and discovered to have been written with a pen in Hebrew, plain and legible, according to the article. The article continues with an account of one Dr. West of Stockbridge, who relates that an old Indian informed him, this is in quotes, that his fathers in this country had not long since been in the possession of a book, which they had had for a long time, carried with them, but having lost the knowledge of reading it, they buried it with an Indian chief, close quote. For obvious reasons, this account resonated with the saints. Antiquated records written in Hebrew, buried in the earth by people who had lost their knowledge. The following year, in 1843, in April, a group of men conspired to create a half a dozen small bell-shaped metal plates with inscriptions etched with acid and chemically treated to make them appear ancient. The plates were created by W.P. Harris, William Fugit, Bridge Whitten, and Robert Wiley, and other accomplices. The plates were placed atop a skeleton in a burial mound in Kinderhook, Illinois, and the men invited several others who were unaware of the hoax to witness their discovery, one of which was a Mormon. The forgers appeared to have been laying a translation trap for Joseph, in quote, by way of a joke, according to one of the forgers. But the prophet didn't seem to dedicate much time to them. As Fugit claimed, we understood Joe Smith said the plates would make a book of about 1,200 pages, but he would not agree to translate them until they were sent to the Antiquarian Society in Philadelphia, France, and England. He's covering his bases, apparently. Although there are minor discrepancies in the accounts surrounding the discovery of these plates and Joseph's subsequent involvement with them, it does seem clear that he spent a brief amount of time with them and made some attempts to read them. The Times and Seasons reported that Mr. Smith had those plates, but what his opinion concerning them we have not yet ascertained. However, both William Clayton and Parley Pratt make reference to Joseph's preliminary interpretation of them, which we'll come to shortly. Significantly, as Brian Hoglid noted, unlike Joseph's translation of the Book of Mormon, the Bible, and the Egyptian papyri, there's never any indication that a scribe was hired. There's no record of any translation session, nor is there any discussion of plans to publish or distribute the translations. And as Stanley B. Kimball notes in The Ensign, I think it's 1981, significantly, there is no evidence that the prophet Joseph Smith ever took up the matter with the Lord, as he did when working with the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham. Now, evidence suggests that Joseph may have been interested in translating the plates through non-revelatory means, rather than attempting to do an inspired translation. One non-LDS witness stated that the plates are evidently brass and are covered on both sides with hieroglyphics. They were brought up and shown to Joseph Smith. He compared in my presence with his Egyptian alphabet that they are evidently the same characters. He therefore will be able to decipher them. Now this quote I attribute to Don Bradley, and he has argued that the Egyptian alphabet mentioned above refers to what is known as the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language. And a comparison of its contents reveals that by happenstance, one of the characters contained therein is virtually identical to one of the most prominent etchings on the Kinderhook plates. They're both boat-shaped. The translation given in the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language for this boat-shaped character is named Ho-i-upa, is honor by birth, kingly power by the line of Pharaoh, possession by birth, one who reigns upon his throne universally, possession of heaven and of the blessings of the earth. Now this matches very closely William Clayton's description of Joseph's translation, that the plates, quote, contain the history of the person with whom they were found, and he was a descendant of Ham through the loins of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and that he received his kingdom from the ruler of heaven and earth. Parley P. Pratt, his account also seems to validate, but also add to Clayton's. Pratt notes that the plates were small and filled with engravings in Egyptian language and contain the genealogy of one of the ancient Jaredites, back to Ham, the son of Noah, and that's an important detail. His addition is significant because it explicitly connected those supposed artifacts to the Book of Mormon, as had come to be expected of all Native American artifacts. In the early 1840s, a flurry of articles appeared in the Times and Seasons that cited and commented extensively on Stevens and Catherwood's incidents of travel in Central American Yucatan, the first broadly available book that gave most Americans their first real glimpse at the magnificent architecture of the ancient Maya. And Matt Roper is going to be speaking much more on this and their impact momentarily. So it will suffice to say that Joseph and others exultantly touted them as virtual proof of the Book of Mormon's divine authenticity. But to reiterate, Joseph never showed any interest in creating a geographic model for the Book of Mormon. Any and all artifacts from virtually anywhere in the Americas were treated equally as evidence for the book's divine authenticity. To conclude, although the saints were surrounded by Native American material culture virtually everywhere they settled, there are only a handful of events that indicate Joseph was directly interacting with or commenting on them. He does not seek them out, but rather only comments on them when they happen to come to his attention. But as Terrell Gibbons notes, Joseph and his fellow leaders actually did all they could to strengthen the Book of Mormon's position as a Rosetta Stone to vanished American civilizations, as if both ancient history and modern religion would benefit by the connection. Almost without exception, Joseph seeks to sacralize Native American artifacts by placing them within the context of scriptural peoples and places, the very scriptures that he helped bring to light. The artifacts and the scriptures had a symbiotic relationship in his mind. The scriptures provided the history of the objects, and the objects provided the history of the scriptures. Thank you.